Higher education accreditation is a structure used as a quality assurance process through which institutions or educational programs are evaluated by an external body to determine if predefined standards are met. Standards for effectiveness often address the quality of learning resulting from academic and co-curricular learning experiences, the infrastructure that supports the delivery of programs, and processes that are in place to ensure continual improvement. This session will consist of a panel focused on important suggestions that can lead towards successful accreditation experiences that you can transfer into your own institutional context. My name is Frederick Barak, Director of Assessment at Kansas State University. My responsibility is guiding and confirming effective assessment processes across the institution. Our office supports and provides data for all forms of accreditation. I also have been an accreditation reviewer for the Higher Learning Commission for many years. When addressing the expectations of accrediting agencies, it is important that the institution, programs, and faculty understand that meeting the standards is the minimum acceptable level to be accredited. The goal is not to meet the standard, but to document the extent to which the level defined in the standard has been exceeded. I often explain that meeting accreditation is an expectation, not the goal. Meeting accreditation standards without confirming the extent to which the standard has been exceeded is like confirming mediocrity. What will set an institution or program apart from others is the extent to which the standard has been exceeded. Most accreditation agencies are hoping to see documentation as to the current level of meeting the standards and the capability for the measures used to expose component aspects of the standard upon which improvement has been achieved or could be attained in the future. The process of providing evidence to support your claims of meeting accreditation standards should not be a challenge if you have an assessment plan that collects and analyzes the data on a continual and a consistent basis. Since the expectations for accreditation define the minimum expectations for an accredited institution or program, these data should be available on a consistent basis and integrated into common practice. The accreditation expectations are often stated as in a generalized format, so there will probably be multiple data points that will be used to the institution or the program, with collected data used during an annual self-review to explore the effectiveness of the current practice. When used to guide continual improvement, which is one of the primary goals of accreditation, annual self-review of assessment data should be a dual purpose. The data should be used to confirm the extent of meeting and exceeding the effectiveness of expectations, but also for the purpose of continual improvement. The data must be able to expose areas that could be improved. Exposing these challenges is a primary purpose for any assessment process if it is to be used for continual improvement. If data are annually collected and used for self-review, then the reporting and accompanying narrative for accreditation will have already been completed. When an institution or program finds preparation for an accreditation challenging, this is an indication of a faulty assessment process in between accreditation visits. At our institution, our goal is to review all accreditation expectations as well as the component parts of each standard on an annual basis. We work to automate the collection of data for student learning experiences in and out of classes, and demographic data for comparative analysis, to guide improvement decisions and educational adjustments. When accreditation reporting is needed, the data collected annually can be summarized for an accreditation period as well as disaggregated to demonstrate improvements and continual challenges.
Hi, everybody. I'm Yurong Sweetland from Franklin University. At Franklin University, I am the Director of Assessment responsible for academic as well as co-curricular assessment. And I'm also a faculty of Research Methods, Evaluation, and Assessment. For the past few years, I have been a Higher Learning Commission peer reviewer. Franklin University is a private, not-for-profit institution. We are located in Columbus, Ohio. And we have a lot of online courses, but we also have some face-to-face courses. One unique thing about Franklin University is the collaborative academic model. So our courses and academic programs are designed by these collaborative teams that consist of major area faculty who have the content expertise and instructional designers who have expertise in teaching and learning and instructional design. So faculty involvement is critical for the success of academic assessment. Accrediting bodies emphasize faculty participation. Here are two examples from the Higher Learning Commission evaluation criteria. So the first one says the institution has sufficient numbers and continuity of faculty members to carry out both the classroom and non-classroom roles of faculty, including oversight of the curriculum and expectations for student performance, assessment of student learning, and establishment of academic credentials for instructional staff. Obviously, I bolded these particular parts to draw your attention. And then the next example that I cited is the institution's processes and methodologies to assess student learning reflect good practice, including the substantial participation of faculty, instructional, and other relevant staff members. So involving faculty members, means that for each step of the assessment process, the faculty should be engaged, or the overall process could be faculty-driven and faculty-led. So now let's look at the steps in the assessment process. Defining learning outcomes. Obviously, this should be a faculty-driven process. And then faculty have the knowledge to create the curriculum map to identify where each learning outcome is introduced and reinforced, and what kind of scaffolding is available in the curriculum for students to achieve the learning outcomes, and where gaps might exist. Then faculty identifying assessment methods, which should be tied closely with the learning outcomes to ensure validity. As assessment professionals, so we can, of course, help provide consultation guidance on the steps, but they should reflect faculty input, expertise, and definitely, their involvement in this. Then with regard to data collection and analysis, as assessment professionals, we obviously will play a big part in this. Depending on the nature of the institution, the assessment participation from the assessment office or assessment professionals will look very different from institution to institution. So at my institution, like some of the other institutions, we have assessment dashboard that lets faculty access assessment data. However, some faculty still needs a little bit help in accessing data. And also we collaborate with faculty in analyzing data. For example, at my institution, we have a lot of transfer students who transfer in our college writing courses. So I'm working with our writing faculty member to break down the analysis based on the transfer credit hours to see, how students might be performing differently based on whether they transfer in the college writing courses or not. But last but not least, the faculty are responsible for identifying improvement strategies for curriculum and instruction. As assessment professionals will help facilitate this process. And for example, at my institution, we recently conducted an annual assessment report review process, during which we found some good examples of using assessment findings to drive improvement. So we hosted a faculty forum to share these examples, and we invited a few faculty members to share their strategies. We all know that there are barriers to faculty involvement in assessment, and I know there have been studies on this topic. And I think one of the major issues is the message that we convey. When we say, hey, we conduct assessment for accreditation and compliance purposes, it is conceived as an external burden. And I recommend that we emphasize the purpose of assessing for improving our curriculum and instruction. So that's assessment for improvement purposes. As a faculty member myself, student success is near and dear to my heart. I just feel good when our students achieve success and have very good things to say about my class, my teaching, and our program overall. So I think that assessment, for better curriculum, for better instruction, and enhanced student success. If we phrase assessment that way, we can help encourage faculty members to participate. Another factor, that as I see it, is assessment has often been viewed as mundane administrative responsibilities. I truly think of assessment as a scholarship on teaching and learning. Assessment experts at James Madison University, led by Dr. Keston Fulcher, have been advocating this model called weigh pig, feed pig, and reweigh pig. So this is truly, assessment is truly an intellectual inquiry. We start with a fundamental question: to what extent are students learning? And then we implement strategies to improve learning, and then we collect the data to see whether we're successful or not, whether our students are learning at a higher rate, are more successful. And obviously, we want to use our findings to make recommendations on continuous improvement strategies. So the next topic I want to talk about is documenting and focusing on continual improvement. Again, these are important considerations for accrediting bodies. Here's some examples from SAC-COC and Higher Learning Commission. So the SAC-COC criteria says, accreditation requires institutional commitment to the concept of quality enhancement through continuous assessment and improvement. Again, I highlight this to draw your attention. And for Higher Learning Commission, its criterion 4 says, the institution demonstrates responsibility for the quality of its educational programs, learning environments, and support services. And it evaluates their effectiveness for student learning through processes designed to promote continuous improvement. So gone are the days when you just conduct assessment every 10 years. I'd like to provide you some examples of evidence of continuous improvement. So the first, agenda or meeting minutes of committees related to using assessment findings to improve the curriculum. This could be from the assessment committee or curriculum committee, or could be collaborative work between the two committees on your campus. Or sometimes it could be just departmental college discussions that focus on using assessment findings to continuously improve the curriculum, the pedagogy. The next part, next example that I have is the assessment guide. Assessment guide, you probably want to clearly state that assessment is ongoing at your institution. You might want to include some cycles, assessment cycles in your guide to clearly articulate the schedule that you use to collect the data, analyze data, and implement improvement strategies. So the next example I put here is curriculum maps. The different versions of curriculum maps showing that curriculum has been undergoing continuous improvement, and the assessment findings informing the changes in the curriculum. Um, Last but not least, assessment reports. In my example list, assessment reports, many institutions have assessment reports. These provide good evidence of using assessment to drive continuous improvement. And obviously, institutions are all different. And based on our different academic model, organizational structure, the evidence we collect and the documentations we keep are going to vary. Based on my experience with Higher Learning Commission, they're not prescriptive at all. The reviewers, as a reviewer myself, we just want to see that institutions have solid evidence demonstrating that you have the structure or mechanism in place for continuous improvement, for using assessment findings to drive continuous improvement. And you have the documentation showing that this is an ongoing practice.
Hi, this is Glenn Phillips. I'm the Director of Assessment for Howard University. We operate as the Office of Institutional Research and Assessment. We're the assessment arm of the university. There are multiple assessment areas across Howard, but they are centralized within the IRA. I've been at Howard for the last 3 years, starting my journey at University of Texas at Arlington before coming to Howard, and was hired just before our Middle States visit in 2020 and 2021. For accreditation to be seen as a part of a continual process for self-review, accreditation must first be seen as a process and not a product. All too often, institutions approach accreditation as the thing we must do every 10 years, every 8 years, or every 7 years to stay accredited. Because of that, accreditation is seen as a final product that goes forward to be submitted to an external body that comes back to us in some way. And while there is a process of accreditation or a cycle of accreditation, accreditation activities should actually be ongoing throughout every academic year. And part of this is the posturing of the institution towards what accreditation is, that accreditation is a snapshot in time of the great work of the institution that is ongoing. So accreditation should be this guiding hand towards integrated and sustained assessment, and not this threat of institutional punishment. When I came to Howard, like many other assessment professionals, I was hired as a part of the accreditation response. I was hired about 16 months before they went through accreditation. And it was that response that painted me as an accreditation person instead of an assessment person or a program review person or a general education person, or really what I wanted to be, which was a continuous improvement person. And the way the institution approaches accreditation and the idea of accreditation is incredibly important. So I would submit that understanding accreditation as a process and not a product can really be beneficial towards that final goal. Part of understanding the goals of accreditation is seeing what the story of your timeline tells. Unfortunately, when people use timelines related to accreditation, they often focus on just gathering information at a certain time to be able to showcase what they're supposed to be doing. Accreditation timelines can actually be really destructive to the internal culture of assessment at an institution, because it pivots the story from let's talk about the good work that we're doing to let's stop all that good work to tell a different story that is in line with the story that we think an accreditor wants. One of the changes from going from SACS institutions to Middle States institutions was that in SACS, it was far more compliance driven. Here is the standard. Here is how we meet the standard. Here is how we're moving forward with validating that we meted the standard. Here is us reifying that we have met the standard. With Middle States, it's slightly different, because in Middle States, they want you to tell a story. Underlying that, in my personal opinion, there is also that desire for the SACS-related compliance, but Middle States doesn't want to posture themselves the same way that SACS does. And so they want to open it up more to suggest that we invite your story. We hope in the process of that story, you tell us the things that we need to know. But in our most recent reaffirmation process, our approach was far more SACS oriented in here is the standard, here is how we meet the standard, here is evidence supporting that we meet the standard, and then again, here is how we meet the standard. So I think that when we talk about the timelines of the institution, if our timeline is organized to the timeline of the accrediting body, then it tells the university that the reason why we're doing this is for accreditation. For example, if you have a general education cycle of 8 years, where in 8 years you go through a process of looking at multiple gen ed outcomes, then that's telling the people who are working with gen ed that we assess gen ed specifically to meet the goal of gen ed assessment within Middle States accreditation in our situation. And instead of being able to say, we're assessing this in a process because we care about it and we want to improve and we want to build a better machine of learning for our students that has better outcomes. I would also submit that accreditation should be a snapshot and not a finish line. The goal of, in my opinion, again, every assessment office should be that accreditation could happen at any time, any year, without being told, and that no one's heart rate or blood pressure would rise because the data is already there. It's just a process of gathering it up and submitting it in a systematic way. So one of the suggestions that I would have is that as we think about our timelines, think instead of aligning them with accreditation to aligning them with the goals that we have for those different areas. If we're doing annual assessment, for example, we don't have to have an 8-year review of annual assessment if that doesn't make sense. It may be wise for us to review assessment every 4 or 5 years. And if accreditation happens to the university at an off year in that timeline, so be it. Accreditation should be able to look in, and the accreditation professionals and peer reviewers that are part of it should be able to look in, see what's going on at the institution in a continuous way, and recognize that they're not always going to be at the beginning or the end of something, that their job is to pull back the curtain, see what's happening, and then be able to comment on that and make decisions from that. So I would submit that timelines can be very useful, but they can also be used really poorly if they are aligned only to accreditation, because it tells your campus community that the reasoning behind your activity is for accreditation and not for continuous improvement. This is an example of what I believe accreditation time cycle should look like or should include, which is this baseline accreditation trajectory that we are always gathering things for what used to be regional, what is now institutional accreditation. But on top of that, there are also timelines for assessment, timelines for program review, timelines for discipline-specific accreditation. And what I think is most important is that we are also gathering artifacts and data throughout that cycle, that we are gathering reports that are being created, we are gathering graphical data or infographics, we're gathering whether we're being talked about on the news, good or bad, and we're talking about how our students are making the news. We're talking about our graduation outcomes and where we fall on US News and World Report. We're gathering all of that data continuously, and it could be in a shared drive or a more developed platform that's been produced. It could be in an old school file folder if people are back on campus. But then when accreditation comes, it really is more opening up your scrapbook and showing them about what's happened in the last 8 or 10 years, instead of running around to everyone that you know and asking if they have any pictures. And so I think a systematic way of thinking about accreditation almost like scrapbooking is, and my dissertation chair who was a scrapbooker would love that I'm talking about scrapbooking for the first time in my professional life. But thinking about accreditation as scrapbooking, and that it's not something that you do when it's all over. It's something that you do continuously. So if someone shows interest, you're able to simply open up the scrapbook and tell them the story of the institution. And then finally, I would suggest, and again, I don't mean to raise people's blood pressure, but to make every year an accreditation year. If we believe that every year is an accreditation year, then we are actually thinking about this continuous data gathering. We are thinking about this continuous professional development for faculty and staff. What often happens is in the months preceding a campus visit, faculty, specifically new faculty, will be tagged for the first time to understand what they know about institutional accreditation. Many of them may already be familiar with discipline level accreditation, but what do you understand about middle states? What do you understand about SACs? How is this affecting you? And what implications does the accreditation process have on you? Or what implications do the different areas that we note in accreditation have on you? Because they may be asked these questions. So I think it's important to think about this professional development for faculty and staff on an ongoing basis, so they aren't, for lack of better terms, blindsided by an accreditation year or accreditation activity that they didn't know anything about. And then working on the narrative creation at an early time instead of gathering it all at the very last second. If you develop a process by which monthly or quarterly or semesterly or even annually, you are reflecting back on the kind of things that should go in your narrative and the way that it would be written, then it would be much easier at the very end of that accreditation cycle to gather that information and tell that story. And this is not unlike what we do when we do research, that we have annotated bibliographies where we dig into the data and we write things up, and often the information from those bibliographies can actually be used as part of a lit review or something like that. And then finally, to have continuous minor processes that feed into a major process. So instead of thinking we have this thing called accreditation that we must solve, how can we break this up into manageable chunks? Instead, think about these are the multiple things that we value, that we care about, that we do continuously. Now, how can we braid these threads in an interesting way that can develop into an accreditation narrative and serve the purposes of accreditation? So I think as we pivot towards understanding accreditation as a continuous process of self-review, it's important that we start rethinking the timelines that we use, rethinking the data collection activities that we have, and then rethinking the ways in which we approach the narrative of accreditation at our institution.
In this section of today's program, I'm going to be talking about the views of peer reviewers who are charged with assessing or evaluating the effectiveness of assessment approaches on the campus. And in talking about that, I will talk about the varied expectations from different accreditors, what some of the challenges are, how peer reviewers maybe interpret those challenges, as well as the standards, and some good examples that we find and some less than good examples of what we find. And then finally, to provide some advice for institutions that are preparing for an accreditation visit, whether it's a focused visit or a comprehensive. So with that in mind, I will begin by sharing my screen and a picture of the regional model. Here, just a moment, sorry. There we go. This map shows you what the various regions look like in the 6 accrediting regions of the United States. The states in red are the Higher Learning Commission region, which is the one with which I have the most experience. And the green is the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, which you can see is the second largest. And I put those up there because the very first advice I would provide is that you need to be clear about what the expectations are that you're attempting to meet. And so I would read the explicit guidance provided by my regional accreditor. And the HLC's explicit guidance is here. Core component 4B talks about effective processes, using the information to improve student learning, reflecting good practice, and including substantial participation. This is it. This is the entirety of what they say. And as I know that you probably have experienced, lots of people think that HLC says lots more than this about what the expectations are. And that's, I think, a part that we should talk about today is, what is real and what are the perceptions. The Southern Association, in contrast, has a greater number of specific items that they wish to see included in good assessment practice, but still relatively modest in the detail that they provide. In addition to regional accreditors, there are also a large number of specialized accreditors. And this particular example comes from ABET, which is an engineering technology accreditor. And by the way, I'm guessing there are probably hundreds of specialized accreditors. I do know that in my experience at Ferris, we worked with 34 different specialized accreditors in addition to HLC. So it becomes important also programmatically to understand what it is that the specialized or program accreditors expect of their accredited programs. So this is an example of what ABET offers, and they're actually very detailed in their guidance and include learning assessment in 3 of their criteria. To find a list of all the the specialized accreditors, you can go to this location where all of the recognized accreditors are listed. But what I would say in conclusion is that there is great unanimity in what good practice looks like. It's well established over a great length of time. This is not a new concept. My work with accreditation goes back to the 1980s. So we're not talking about something that's new. So we do know what works and what does not work. And in general, the accreditors are quite consistent in their guidance. So as a peer reviewer, how do we interpret those standards that we are offered, which, as you see, are really very succinct? Well, the very first thing that you need to know is that whenever we talk assessment, we're talking assessment of student learning. We are not talking about graduation rates. We are not talking about retention. We are not talking about grades. We are talking about assessment of student learning. And the expectations that we often share, even though the wording is not explicit in the criteria, is that we expect that there is a plan, because most of us think that it is going to be very difficult for there to be effective practices or even good practice if we don't have a plan for what that practice would look like. And with that plan would often be timelines. That the methods of assessment are appropriate to the intended learning outcome. And an example I would use is if you say that you're going to construct a model of something in a given class, then it's pretty hard for me to understand how a multiple choice test might give you the evidence you need about whether a student is really able to construct a model. And this disparity between the outcome statement and the assessment method is more common than you might think. We expect that there is data being collected, direct and indirect, qualitative and quantitative. So there is not a bias that needs to all be quantitative. that we also expect that the data is being analyzed and that it's being used to improve student learning. Additionally, we expect that there are findings and that actions are taken as appropriate, and that those actions are explicit and visible, which means they are documented. That the results of these learning outcomes are shared with appropriate stakeholders, and each institution will determine who those appropriate stakeholders are. That there is an emphasis on improving learning outcomes and institutional performance, and not just complying with accreditation expectations. It's a mindset of improvement and a focus on learning and not a focus on compliance. And in fact, if you focus on student learning, I would have a hard time imagining an institution that wouldn't be in full compliance. And the assessment is consistent with the institutional mission and its context. So when we find things that are really good, as we often do, what do those things look like? Well, here are some of the things. First, that there is an infrastructure for assessment sustainability. That often means that there is a director of assessment and probably an office of some type. It may be a release time faculty member, but there are adequate resources to carry out the work of the plan and for the institution to create value from these processes. That there is a culture that embraces the importance of enhancing student learning and that recognizes the value of assessment data in informing this improvement practice. That the plan is systematically implemented, although I think that a lot of slack is being caught with the complicated last year that we've all had, but in general, the plan needs to be followed and that it is well suited to the organizational mission. And finally, that there is a commitment to transparency about the assessment findings. This is not about exposing shortcomings. It is about learning more about how our students learn and which students are learning so that we can continually improve those outcomes. Areas needing improvement. 40% of the institutions in the 2018-2019 cycle of HLC were cited for having needed improvement in the area of assessment, which is a disappointing outcome, and disappointing in particular because this is not new for us. These expectations have existed since the 1980s. So when improvement is needed, what's it look like? Well, for the most part, it looks like the opposite of the things I just talked about that would be good. The absence of a plan, the absence of adequate resources, the feeling that the assessment activities aren't someone's work, or simply failing to use the data, which is very common. I've seen lots of examples of lots of data being collected and no data being used. So what would my advice for institutions be? Well, I would begin with a review of the curriculum and be sure that the outcomes that are specified are appropriate and that they are measurable, that they are observable. In my experience, assessment practice is often thwarted by an imprecise curriculum. One of the tools I would use to review the curriculum would be to assure that things are at the appropriate level, that higher level classes are having higher level expectations, and that assessment that is being reported on is probably not below the level of application on either of these models of Bloom's taxonomy. So what advice would I offer? Well, when you have a visit, the very first thing is it cannot be just the assessment director who does all the talking or the academic VP. Many have to be able to speak to how they have used data to improve students' learning. Institutions need to regularly engage faculty and staff colleagues in not only professional development, since many of our faculty come with disciplinary expertise, but not educational expertise. And we need to have ongoing learning assessment focused conversations. We need to consider having a glossary for how we use different terms. And in fact, lots of institutions talk most about learning and not about assessment. And you need to build a plan that is both sustainable and valuable, which means it produces data that you can act upon and that informs good practice. You need to make your plans for assessment visible. And finally, you need to regularly emphasize and reemphasize the purposes of assessment that are to gather and utilize data for the primary purpose of helping all students learn more and better.
I hope you gained some important and valuable information that will be useful to you in your accreditation and assessment processes. In conclusion, we would like to emphasize that the purpose of accreditation is to help all students learn. Assessment is ultimately for the improvement of curriculum, pedagogy, and student success. And good assessment practices empower us by creating equitable learning environments and successful institutions. Within the process for assessment and accreditation, faculty involvement is essential. And solid documentation is key to demonstrating this commitment to continuous improvement. We'd like to thank you for listening to our presentation today, and feel free to email any of us if you have any questions or if for any further discussion. Thank you very much.